In the summer of 1858, Ezra McCain rode into Lawrence, Kansas with $87 in his pocket and 15 years of loneliness weighing on his shoulders, never imagining that an impulse at an illegal slave auction would lead him to bid his entire life savings on a widowed woman named Sarah and her 5 young sons. The Kansas territory buzzed with tension as pro-slavery and abolitionist forces clashed along the Missouri border, turning every settlement into a potential battleground where a man's moral choices could cost him everything he owned. Sarah Washington stood on that auction block with the dignity of a queen despite her shackles, while her boys huddled close beside her, their ages ranging from 4-year-old Tommy to 16-year-old Marcus, who burned with the quiet rage of someone planning either escape or revenge. The other bidders saw property to be worked until it broke, but something deeper stirred in Ezra as he watched this family face their fate with courage he had forgotten he possessed. When the auctioneer called for final bids, and the cruel overseer, Silas Webb, raised his hand with a confident sneer, Ezra found himself shouting a number that would empty his bank account and change 7 lives forever. The wagon ride back to his failing ranch stretched long and silent, filled with the weight of unspoken questions about what came next for a broken-down cattleman and the family he had bought but never intended to own. Now Ezra McCain would discover that the hardest battles are not fought with guns and fury, but with the slow daily choice to open a guarded heart to the possibility of love. The morning sun cast long shadows across McCain Ranch as smoke drifted from the burned-out barn. Ezra McCain stood in his yard, blood seeping through his torn shirt sleeve, a Winchester rifle loose in his weathered hands. 3 bodies lay motionless in the dirt near the water trough. Behind an overturned wagon, a woman pressed 5 boys against her skirts. Sarah Washington kept her dark eyes fixed on the horizon, watching for more trouble. Her oldest son, Marcus, gripped a shotgun with hands that barely trembled. The others clustered close, faces streaked with soot and fear. Little Tommy broke free from his mother's grip. His bare feet kicked up dust as he ran to Ezra, small arms wrapping around the rancher's legs. "Pa! Pa! Are you hurt?" The word hung in the air like gunpowder smoke. Ezra's face went still. He had never been called that before, not once in 45 years of walking this earth. Hoofbeats thundered from the east. Sheriff Bradley rode hard, with 6 men trailing behind him, their badges catching morning light. The lawman's horse reared as he took in the scene. Bodies, blood, a white rancher standing with a black family like they belonged to him. Ezra McCain. Bradley's voice carried the weight of judgment. "You're under arrest for harboring fugitive, slaves, and murder." Sarah stepped forward, her chin raised despite the circumstances. She had buried one husband already. She would not bury another family without a fight. "Sheriff, those men came to take my children. We defended our home." Bradley's laugh came out harsh. "Your home? Last I checked, slaves don't own property in Kansas territory." Ezra met Sarah's eyes. Something passed between them. An understanding built over months of shared meals and mended fences, of nights spent nursing sick cattle and days spent building something that looked like hope. "They're not slaves, Sheriff." Ezra's voice cut through the morning air. "They're my family." 6 months earlier, Ezra McCain had ridden into Lawrence, Kansas with $87 and a list of supplies he could barely afford. His ranch was failing the way everything in his life eventually failed. Cattle died of disease. Workers quit for better pay elsewhere. Creditors sent letters he pretended not to receive. The town buzzed with the kind of tension that came before storms. Pro-slavery men from Missouri crossed the border looking for trouble. Abolitionists preached fire and brimstone in the streets. Everyone carried guns. Most were willing to use them. Ezra tied his horse outside Morrison's trading post and pushed through the crowd gathered behind the building. He had come for supplies, not spectacle, but the sight stopped him cold. An auction block stood in the dusty lot, a makeshift thing built from wooden crates and railroad ties. But it served its purpose well enough. Sarah Washington stood on that platform with 5 boys pressed against her brown dress. The auctioneer called out bids like he was selling livestock. Men shouted numbers and studied Sarah like she was a horse they might ride to death. Her dignity struck Ezra first. The way she held her shoulders straight despite the iron shackles. The way she kept her boys calm with nothing but the steady rhythm of her breathing. She had been broken by circumstances, but not by spirit. The boys ranged, from barely walking to nearly grown. Tommy clung to his mother's skirt, thumb in his mouth. Benjamin and Samuel stood like bookends, 7 and 10 years old with eyes too serious for their ages. David, 13, kept watch over his younger brothers while Marcus glared at every white face in the crowd with the focused hatred of someone planning revenge. Silas Webb stepped forward when the bidding opened. Ezra knew Webb by reputation. The man ran a cotton operation across the Missouri line where workers died young and died often. His smile never reached his pale eyes. 500, Webb called out. Other voices joined in. 600. 700. The numbers climbed while Sarah kept her face perfectly still. She had learned long ago that showing fear only made men like Webb hungrier. Ezra found himself calculating. $87 in his pocket. Maybe 300 more in the bank if he emptied his account. Completely. Not enough to matter in this crowd. But something twisted in his chest as he watched Tommy reach for his mother's hand. The boy looked exactly like Ezra's unborn son might have looked. The child who died with Mary 15 years ago when fever swept through their valley like wildfire. 800, Webb announced with the confidence of a man who had never lost an auction. The crowd went quiet. $800 was more than most men made in 2 years of honest work. Ezra stepped forward before his mind could catch up with his heart. 850. Every head turned. Webb's smile faltered for the first time. Sarah's eyes found Ezra's face and held there, searching for something she could trust. Do I hear 900? The auctioneer looked directly at Webb. The overseer studied Ezra with the cold attention of a snake measuring a mouse. He had plenty of money, but he also had plenty of other opportunities to buy what he needed. This broken-down rancher looked desperate enough to bid his last penny. Webb shrugged and stepped back. He can have them. The gavel fell with a sound like thunder. Ezra walked forward on unsteady legs. He had just spent money he did not have, on 5 people he did not know. His ranch was failing. His debts were mounting. And now he had 5 more mouths to feed. Sarah watched him approach with the wariness of someone who had learned that white men's kindness always came with a price. What exactly do you want from us? She asked. Ezra looked at her boys, at Tommy's tear-streaked face and Marcus's clenched fists, at the way they all stood ready to run or fight depending on what came next. I don't rightly know, he admitted. Webb appeared at Ezra's shoulder before they could leave. His breath smelled like whiskey and tobacco. His smile promised trouble. You just made a powerful enemy, McCain. That woman and those boys will bring you nothing but grief. The wagon ride back to the ranch stretched long and uncomfortable. Sarah sat beside Ezra on the driver's bench, her back straight as a fence post. The boys huddled in the wagon bed, whispering escape plans they thought no one could hear. Marcus studied every landmark they passed, every creek crossing and stand of trees. He was memorizing the route back to town, back to freedom. His mother had taught him to read the North Star. He could find his way to Kansas City if he had to. Ezra's ranch appeared as the sun touched the western horizon. The house needed paint, the barn needed repairs, cattle grazed in pastures grown wild with weeds. Everything looked exactly like what it was. The home of a man who had stopped trying. Sarah examined the failing operation with calculating eyes. She had managed her late husband's farm in Ohio for 3 years before raiders came in the night. She knew good land from bad. She knew the difference between poverty and poor management. This place could prosper with the right attention. Ezra pulled the wagon to a stop near the front porch. Nobody moved for a long moment. 5 strangers and a lonely man sat in the gathering dusk, wondering what came next. Tommy was the first to climb down. His small boots hit the ground with a soft thud. He looked around at the wide sky and endless grass with something that might have been wonder. Is this where we live now? He asked. Ezra looked at Sarah, at Marcus still planning escape routes, at 4 boys who had never known a safe place to sleep. I reckon so, he said. But even as he spoke the words, Ezra McCain knew that the hardest part was just beginning. The first test came 3 nights later when storm clouds gathered like bruises across the Kansas sky. Marcus had been watching, waiting, learning the rhythm of Ezra's evening routine. The man drank whiskey on the porch until the bottle made him careless. Then he stumbled inside and slept like the dead. Marcus slipped from the barn where they had been sleeping on hay bales. He had gathered supplies over 2 days. Bread wrapped in cloth, a water jug, his father's compass that somehow survived the auction. His brothers needed to move while they still could. But Tommy was missing. The 4-year-old had wandered off during the afternoon and never returned. Sarah paced the yard, calling his name into the wind. David and Samuel searched the creek bed. Benjamin checked the root cellar twice. Marcus found tiny boot prints leading toward the river where cottonwoods grew thick as castle walls. The storm hit as he followed the trail, rain turning dust to mud and washing away any trace of where Tommy might have gone. Ezra appeared through the downpour without a word. He carried a lantern and moved with the steady purpose of a man who had searched for lost things before. Sarah emerged from the tree line, her dress soaked through, her face tight with the kind of fear that lived in every mother's chest. They found Tommy huddled in a hollow log, shivering and crying for his mama. The boy threw himself into Sarah's arms while thunder shook the ground beneath their feet. Marcus expected punishment, expected questions about why he had taken supplies, expected the back of Ezra's hand across his face. Instead, Ezra lifted Tommy onto his shoulders and led them all back to the house. "You'll catch your death out here," he said to Sarah. "Bring the boys inside." The kitchen was small, but warm. Sarah wrapped Tommy in blankets while Ezra built up the fire. Marcus stood dripping by the door, ready to run if this kindness turned to something else. But Ezra only handed him a towel and pointed toward the hearth. "Why aren't you beating me?" Marcus asked when the others had gone to sleep. Ezra looked up from the ledger he was pretending to read, numbers that never seemed to add up right no matter how many times he worked them. "You came back," he said. "That's what matters." The words hit Marcus like stones thrown at glass. Had never known a white man who cared more about loyalty than obedience, who measured a boy by his choices instead of his mistakes. The second test came when Ezra's ranch hands arrived for work and found a black family eating breakfast at the kitchen table. Joe Murphy and his brother Pat had worked McCain cattle for 3 seasons. They were good men by most measures, but they were also Missouri men with Missouri ideas about the natural order of things. "We can't work alongside them," Joe said, his hat twisted in weathered hands. "It ain't right." Ezra stood on the porch steps, calculating what he could afford to lose. 2 experienced hands meant the difference between bringing in the harvest and watching it rot in the fields. But Sarah had already proven she understood cattle better than both Murphy brothers combined. "Then I reckon you can't work for me," Ezra replied. The brothers rode away, shaking their heads. Word would spread through the county by sundown. Ezra, McCain had chosen a black family over white workers. Some folks would call him a fool, others would call him worse. Sarah watched from the kitchen window as the dust settled behind their wagon. She had been managing farms since she was 15 years old. Her late husband had trusted her with ledgers and livestock sales. She knew what needed doing and how to do it right. "Let me help," she said. Ezra studied her face, looking for something he could recognize. Pride, maybe, or the quiet competence of someone who had carried heavier loads than this one. That afternoon, Sarah walked the fence lines with the steady eye of someone calculating repairs. She examined sick cattle and diagnosed worms that Ezra had missed. She found the leak in the water trough that had been wasting precious well water for months. The boys followed her lead without being asked. David and Samuel repaired broken fence posts with an efficiency that surprised Ezra. Benjamin organized the tool shed according to some system that actually made sense. Even Tommy helped by gathering eggs from hens that had been laying in hidden nests. Only Marcus held back, watching everything with the suspicious attention of someone waiting for the trap to spring shut. The transformation happened gradually, like seasons changing. Sarah took over the ranch ledgers and found money that had been bleeding away through poor record keeping. She negotiated better prices for grain, and discovered that Ezra had been paying twice what feed should cost. The boys created routines that felt like family rhythms. Benjamin taught Ezra to read the words he had been guessing at for years. Samuel showed him how to properly set fence posts so they would not lean after the first hard wind. David shared stories about their father while they worked cattle together. Tommy began calling Ezra Pa without thinking about it. The word slipped out when he was excited or scared or simply happy to see a familiar face. Everyone pretended not to notice. But something shifted in the house each time it happened. Sarah and Ezra worked side by side in the kind of partnership that grew from necessity and deepened into respect. She managed the books, while he handled the heavy labor. He made decisions about livestock while she planned crops and calculated feed requirements. Their hands touched when they passed tools or shared coffee from the same pot. Nothing improper. Nothing that would have raised eyebrows in proper company. But Ezra had not felt a woman's casual touch in 15 years. Sarah had been a widow for 2 years before the auction block. The ranch began to prosper under their combined attention. Cattle gained weight. Crops grew straight and strong. The house stayed cleaner and felt warmer, with voices filling rooms that had been silent too long. But prosperity brought attention. Sheriff Bradley rode out twice in 1 month, asking questions about runaway slaves and checking papers that Sarah did not have. Neighbors complained about armed black men on property that bordered their own land. Silas Webb spread stories through the county about Ezra's intentions. Some said he was planning to arm slaves for rebellion. Others whispered that he had lost his mind with grief and loneliness. All agreed that something needed to be done before the situation got out of hand. Reverend Clark arrived on a Tuesday morning with the kind of serious expression that preceded difficult conversations. He was an abolitionist from Kansas City, with connections to the Underground Railroad. He had heard about Ezra's situation through sources he would not name. "I can get them to Canada," he said over coffee that Sarah had made strong enough to float a horseshoe. "There are families there, free families. They would be safe." Sarah looked at the man who offered salvation with one hand and demanded sacrifice with the other. Canada meant safety for her boys. It also meant leaving the first home they had, known since their father died. Ezra sat quietly at the table, knowing the choice was not his to make. He had bought them at auction, but he could not own their hearts. If they wanted to leave, he would help them pack. Tommy climbed onto Ezra's lap without invitation, small fingers tracing the scars on weathered hands. The boy had no memory of slavery or fear. He only knew that this man told him stories at bedtime and carved wooden horses during long winter evenings. Marcus spoke for the first time since Reverend Clark had arrived. "We stay," he said, his voice carrying the certainty of someone who had measured the cost of running against the value of standing still. "This is our home now." The Reverend left with prayers and warnings. Winter was coming, and with it the kind of desperation that made violent men bolder. Webb would not forget the humiliation of losing an auction to a broken-down rancher. "Sheriff." Bradley could only ignore complaints for so long before political pressure forced his hand. But that evening, as Sarah tucked Tommy into the bed they had moved into the main house, the boy's sleepy voice carried a contentment that had been missing from their lives for longer than anyone could remember. "Good night, Mama. Good night, Pa." Ezra stood in the doorway, listening to words that filled spaces in his chest he had forgotten existed. Sarah brushed past him on her way to check on the other boys, her shoulder touching his arm in the casual way of people who belonged in the same place. Outside wind rattled windows and carried the scent of approaching storms. But inside, something that looked like family had taken root in soil that had been barren too long. The legal papers arrived on a Thursday morning when frost still clung to the fence posts like broken promises. Sheriff Bradley delivered them personally, his face carrying the weight of bad news and political necessity. He handed the documents to Ezra, without meeting his eyes. "Federal marshals are coming," Bradley said. Webb filed papers claiming those people are escaped slaves. Says he has bills of sale to prove it. Sarah stood in the kitchen doorway, flour still dusting her hands from the morning biscuits. She had been expecting this day since the auction. Men like Webb never forgot what they considered stolen property. But as Ezra read the legal documents aloud, Sarah's expression changed from resignation to something sharper. She disappeared. Into the bedroom she shared with Tommy and returned carrying a small leather pouch that had been sewn into the lining of her dress. The papers inside were yellow with age and careful handling. Freedom documents signed by a judge in Ohio. Bills of sale showing her late husband had purchased his own liberty and hers. Birth certificates proving all 5 boys had been born free, on free soil. "We were never slaves," Sarah said, her voice steady as stone. "Not legally, not ever." The truth hit the room like lightning striking dry grass. Webb had kidnapped a free family and sold them at auction. Everything that followed had been built on lies and forged papers. Sarah and her boys could have walked away from any plantation, any auction block, any master who claimed to own them. Ezra studied the documents with hands that trembled slightly. The freedom papers were genuine. The signatures were clear. The legal language was precise and binding. Sarah Washington and her children were as free as any white family in Kansas territory. Marcus took the papers from his mother's hands, reading each word carefully. He had suspected something was wrong about their capture. Raiders had come in the night claiming they were runaway slaves, but his father had always kept the freedom documents safe. Marcus had watched them burn the house down, but apparently they had not found everything. "Why didn't you show these before?" David asked. Sarah looked at her second oldest son with eyes that had seen too much of the world's cruelty. "Freedom. Papers don't stop bullets," she said. "They don't prevent midnight raids or guarantee safe passage. I kept them hidden because they were the only proof we had, the only thing that could save us if we ever got the chance to use them." The revelation changed everything and nothing. They were legally free, but Webb's hired guns would not care about legal documents. Sheriff Bradley could use the papers to refuse cooperation with federal marshals, but he could not protect them from men who operated outside the law. More importantly, freedom meant choice. Real choice. Sarah and her boys could leave Kansas territory. They could travel north to cities where free black families lived without fear. They could start over somewhere Webb would never find them. Ezra sat at the kitchen table staring at documents that gave him everything he wanted and nothing he could keep. The family he had grown to love was free to walk away, free to choose safety over the dangerous life they had built together on his failing ranch. "You should go," he said finally. "Take the boys north where you'll be safe." Sarah folded the papers carefully, returning them to the leather pouch that had protected them through capture and auction, and months of uncertainty. She had spent 2 years planning for this moment. 2 years imagining the day when she could prove her family's freedom and reclaim their stolen lives. But the life she had imagined reclaiming no longer existed. Her husband was dead. Their farm in Ohio was ashes. The boys had no memory of safety or stability before this ranch, this man, this strange family they had assembled from broken pieces. Tommy ran into the kitchen with a wooden horse Ezra had carved for him. The toy was rough-hewn but functional, made from scraps of oak during long winter evenings. The boy climbed onto Ezra's lap without invitation, chattering about the baby, calf that had been born during the night. "Pa, can I name her Buttercup? She's yellow like butter and pretty like flowers." The word still struck Ezra like a physical blow. Pa. Not master or sir or mister. Pa. The title belonged to him now in ways that had nothing to do with ownership, and everything to do with love earned through daily choices. Marcus watched his youngest brother with the calculating attention of someone measuring the cost of different futures. Canada offered safety, but not belonging. The ranch offered danger, but also the first home any of them had known since their father died. "We stay," Marcus said, his voice carrying the authority of the oldest son and the certainty of someone who had weighed the risks against the rewards. "We McCain men don't run from bullies." The name hit different now. McCain. Not Washington, the surname they had inherited from their father. McCain, the name they had chosen by staying when they could have left, by fighting when they could have fled, by calling this place home when the whole world told them they did not belong. Benjamin and Samuel nodded their agreement. David looked to his mother for guidance, but Sarah's face already showed her decision. She had buried one husband who died, defending his family's freedom. She would not abandon another man who was willing to do the same. "Then we prepare," Sarah said. The next 3 days passed like the calm before tornadoes. They moved supplies into the house and checked every rifle and shotgun on the property. Sarah proved to be an excellent shot, her aim steady, and her nerves calm under pressure. She had learned to defend herself during the years when her husband traveled to sell crops and livestock. Marcus cleaned weapons with the methodical attention of someone who understood that lives depended on mechanical precision. David and Samuel practiced loading ammunition until they could do it by feel in darkness. Even Benjamin, at 7 years old, learned to spot riders approaching from long distances. Tommy was too young to understand the specifics, but he absorbed the tension like a sponge soaking up water. He stayed close to Ezra during the day and crawled into bed between his parents at night, seeking comfort from the adults who had become his anchors in an uncertain world. On the third evening, as they sat around the kitchen table sharing what might be their last peaceful meal, Ezra looked at the faces that had become his family. Sarah's quiet strength, Marcus's protective intensity, the younger boy's trust that the adults would keep them safe. He had bought them thinking he was saving them. The truth was more complicated. They had saved him from a loneliness that was killing him slowly, one empty day at a time. They had given him purpose and belonging and the chance to be the kind of man his late wife would have been proud to love. "Whatever happens," Ezra said, "I want you to know this has been the best year of my life." Sarah reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. Her touch was warm and steady, the kind of contact that said more than words ever could. Outside, coyotes howled in the distance. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon, heavy with the promise of rain or worse. But inside the house, 7 people who had found each other against impossible odds, prepared to fight for the right to stay together. Webb's riders would come at dawn. They would come with guns and legal papers and the absolute certainty that might made right on the Kansas frontier. But they would face a family that had chosen love over safety, belonging over survival, and each other over every other option the world had offered them. The house creaked in the wind like a ship riding out rough seas, but it held steady, just like the people sheltered inside its walls. Webb arrived with the false dawn, bringing 6 hired guns and the absolute certainty of a man who had never lost what he considered his property. They surrounded the house like wolves circling wounded prey, their horses snorting steam in the cold morning air. Ezra watched them through the kitchen window, counting rifles and calculating odds that did not favor his family. Sarah positioned herself at the back door with a clear view of the barn. Marcus took the upstairs window that commanded the front yard. The younger boys crouched behind overturned furniture with ammunition boxes and the kind of pale determination that came from having nowhere left to run. Tommy pressed himself against Ezra's leg, small fingers clutching the wooden horse that had become his talisman against fear. The boy did not understand the specifics of what was happening, but he absorbed the tension like prairie grass drinking rain. Webb dismounted slowly, making a show of his confidence. He wore a badge that might have been real and carried papers that were certainly false. His smile held the cold satisfaction of a man who believed the world owed him whatever he was, strong enough to take. "Send out the woman and her boys," Webb called across the yard. "This doesn't have to end badly for anyone." Ezra stepped onto the porch, rifle loose in his hands but ready. He had spent 3 days preparing for this moment, but the weight of it still settled on his shoulders like lead blankets. "They're free people," Ezra replied. "Got papers to prove it." Webb's laugh carried no humor. "Papers don't mean much out here. Possession is what counts, and I'm taking possession of my property." The shooting started when one of Webb's men tried to circle around to the kitchen door. Sarah's rifle spoke first, the shot clean and precise. The man stumbled backward, clutching his shoulder, very much alive but no longer eager for close combat. Marcus fired from the upstairs window, his bullet splintering the wooden post where Webb had taken cover. David and Samuel handed ammunition to the adult shooters with steady hands and faces that belonged on boys much older than 13 and 10. The gunfight lasted 20 minutes but felt like hours. Webb's men had numbers and experience, but they were fighting for money while the McCain family fought for the right to exist. Desperation made Sarah's aim deadly accurate. Love made Ezra's shots count when they mattered most. Benjamin took a bullet in the arm, the wound shallow but painful, enough to make him cry for his mother. Sarah left her position to bandage the boy while Marcus covered her retreat, his rifle speaking in measured intervals that kept Webb's men pinned behind the water trough. The turning point came when Webb made his final mistake. Frustrated by the family's resistance, he broke cover and ran toward the house with his pistol drawn. His target was Tommy, the smallest and most vulnerable member of the family. Ezra met him in the yard with the fury of a man defending his child. Webb raised his gun but never got the chance to fire. Ezra's shot took him center mass, dropping him in the dust beside the fence he had spent months planning to cross. The remaining hired guns lost their taste for fighting when their leader fell. They mounted their horses and rode away without looking back, leaving Webb's body where it had fallen and taking nothing but the knowledge that some families were worth dying for. Sheriff Bradley arrived an hour later with a posse that included the county, judge and 2 witnesses from town. They found Ezra standing over Webb's body, smoking rifle still in his hands. Sarah and the boys emerged from the house looking like survivors of a war they had not chosen, but had certainly won. The legal proceedings took most of the morning. Sarah's freedom papers proved their status beyond any doubt. The judge examined the forged documents Webb had carried and declared them worthless fabrications. Self-defense justified the shooting. The case was closed before noon. Bradley looked at the mixed family standing together in the morning sun, their clothes torn and faces streaked with smoke, but their dignity intact. "I reckon this settles the matter," he said. 6 months later, the McCain ranch prospered like never before. Sarah's management had turned failing livestock into healthy herds. Ezra's willingness to work alongside his family had restored buildings and fences to better condition than they had enjoyed in years. The legal adoption papers were signed on a Tuesday morning in the county courthouse. Marcus, David, Samuel, Benjamin, and Tommy McCain walked out of that building with a surname they had chosen and a father who had chosen them in return. Sarah and Ezra married the following month in a simple ceremony performed by Reverend Clark in the ranch house parlor. No white dress or elaborate celebration, just 2 people who had found love in the space between survival and hope, witnessed by 5 boys who had learned that family was something you built rather than something you were born into. Other freed families settled nearby, drawn by stories of the mixed family that had fought for their right to exist and won. The community grew slowly but steadily, anchored by the knowledge that some places in the world would defend your right to belong. Sunday dinners became sacred rituals around the expanded kitchen table, 7 chairs filled with voices and laughter, and the kind of easy conversation that came from people who knew they were exactly where they belonged. On this particular Sunday, Tommy led the blessing with the serious attention of a 4-year-old who took his responsibilities seriously. "Thank you, God, for bringing Pa to find us," he said, his small voice carrying across the table to adults who still marveled at the improbable chain of events that had brought them together. "And for bringing us to find him." Marcus looked up from his plate, his face carrying the contentment of someone who had found his place in the world after years of searching. "Pa, the cattle in the south pasture need moving tomorrow." Ezra smiled at the boy who had become his son through choice, rather than blood, through loyalty rather than law. "Then we'll move them together, all of us." That evening, as the sun painted the Kansas sky in shades of gold and crimson, 7 silhouettes rode across land that belonged to them, not because they had conquered it, but because they had defended it. Not because the law said they owned it, but because they had chosen to call it home. The McCain family had learned that the most revolutionary act in a world built on hatred was simply the decision to love each other. And in that love they had found something worth fighting for, worth dying for, and ultimately worth living for. The ranch stretched out before them, vast and promising, like the future they would build together one day at a time. And that is all to the story for now. Please let me know where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will create a story there. Consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. And if you enjoy our content, click this video on your screen. I promise you it's worth watching. See you tomorrow.